Amazing. So we're going to now turn to Belinda. Are you ready to share your slides or just speak, whatever you're going to be doing?
So I'm an honorary research fellow at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. I previously taught there. I did my PhD there in gender studies, in focusing on feminist theory and feminist philosophy, particularly around politics. And after that, I taught in gender studies and feminist philosophy before I became a mother. And so I've always been interested in mothering and pregnancy and birth from a feminist perspective, but that's notched up a few levels since becoming a mother myself. My research is around Irigarayan's philosophy as well, who we'll be speaking about today. Also around feminist perspectives on social reproduction and housework and the home, which has also become more significant since becoming a mother. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Lovely
And
to
I'm really,
meet
really happy to be here and that this society exists. Thank you, Anna.
you.
Okay. So my paper's the quote in the title of my paper comes from Irigarayan's speculum of the other woman, which Laura just spoke about. So what if the object started to speak, which is speaking to the notion that woman as constructed as object. It's sort of a provocation that she gives. So what would be the implications if the object of Western culture and philosophy started to speak? And that's sort of the theme of my paper today. So I'm speaking about, there's a podcast called Australian Birth Stories, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a very popular podcast in Australia. It's produced by Sophie Walker, who's pictured on the screen there, who has a background in public health and is a public advocate for improved maternal and infant care in pregnancy, labour and birth, and early postpartum. And she launched the podcast in 2017 with her own story of the birth of her second child, which followed the physically and psychologically traumatic birth of her first child. The podcast is very popular, as I said, with over 17 million downloads. If that means anything to you, it doesn't really mean much to me. And it follows a simple format with Walker interviewing mothers about their experiences of conception, pregnancy, labour and birth. In 2023, Walker began also publishing episodes focusing specifically on mothers' experiences of the early postpartum period, and these sort of are published interchangeably with the birth stories. And the interviews follow a very open-ended and informal structure that allows mothers to meander through their birth stories, often recalling and reflecting on the spot, and sometimes reaching insights on their experiences for the first time in conversation with Walker. In this sense, it often serves as a kind of public mode of self-inquiry and psychological processing for the birthing mothers. The podcast serves a significant function as pregnancy and birth education, both for mothers or birth parents and their partners and families, as well as those working in maternal and infant care. And Walker has said that many of her listeners are midwives or midwifery students. Walker also sells a popular online birth education program called The Birth Class, publishes educational material on pregnancy, labour, birth and early postpartum on the Australian Birth Stories website, and with co-author Jodie Wilson published a book called The Complete Australian Guide to Pregnancy and Birth in 2023. So significantly, Walker makes a point of publishing a wide breadth of birth stories, while she considers it crucial to tell positive and empowering birth stories to counter the dominant Western notions of birth as a negative and largely medical event. She advocates for the importance when preparing for birth or of hearing about the many varied turns that pregnancy, labour and birth can take, which is not advice that I really took up in my pregnancy. The Australian Birth Stories website describes the podcast as a portrait of women navigating their journey to motherhood, a series of honest stories that detail the heartache of infertility, the joy and overwhelm of pregnancy, the challenge and elation of birth, and the tentative first weeks of postpartum. The podcast thus creates space for the deeply complex ambiguity and ambivalence of pregnancy and birth, challenging the sanitized, sentimentalized, medicalized, or completely silenced representations and historical notions of pregnancy and birth in the West. And significantly, this is done through centering the voice and experience of the pregnant and birthing mother. I listened to the podcast only a few times when I was pregnant with my daughter, but became more interested in the episodes following my own traumatic experience of labour, emergency caesarean birth, and obstetric violence. Hearing other women speak about their own, sometimes traumatic, but always emotionally complex experiences helped me begin to process my own. There was something especially in the cadence and expression of mothers' voices, the ways that they piece together a hugely complex and profound psychic, emotional, and physical experience that began to give me a kind of language to navigate my own birth story. This helped me begin to process what I had experienced, which was layered and layered with meaning and emotional charge, but was also marked by gaps and confusion, and for which I held no linear timeline. In addition to this, as a feminist scholar and a scholar of the work of philosopher Irigarayan in particular, I became interested in the feminist significance of the podcast beyond its function as birth education and advocacy. I'm especially interested in the significance of women speaking about the transitory experience of matrescence, of coming to be and be recognised as a mother. And I've turned to Irigarayan's work to examine this significance. Given that labour and birth are arguably the most cataclysmic events in the long period of matrescence, I'm interested in the significance of these moments being orally captured, represented in mothers' own words, and publicly shared. Through this work, I'm considering what impact this has, this process of publicly sharing these birth stories, on a patriarchal, phallocentric culture, and on how women are positioned in that culture. How does the public sharing of mothers' birth stories help to carve out a place, or how might the public sharing of mothers' birth stories help to carve out a place for women, whether mothers or not, significantly, as subjects in patriarchal culture? And further, though I don't really address this in this paper specifically, how might the public sharing of women's birth stories challenge dominant phallocentric Western notions of the self and subjectivity more generally, which we can say privilege a kind of hyper-independence over relational experience? So in this paper, I begin to consider these questions and how Irigarayan's feminist psychoanalytic philosophy can help elaborate what I consider to be the feminist significance of the Australian Birth Stories podcast. I argue that the podcast helps to establish a maternal subjectivity and thus significantly a subject position for potentially all women through creating a public forum where women speak in and on their own terms about pregnancy and birth. This is very emerging work. This is very new, but I hope to develop the project potentially through interviewing Sophie Walker as the podcast creator and host for her insights. But in this short paper, I begin to develop a theoretical grounding for this paper. So Irigarayan, for those of you who aren't familiar with her work, beyond Laura's previous paper, she's a Belgian-French philosopher, known especially for her significant contributions to European feminist philosophy, particularly in the period of the 1970s and 80s, including her psychoanalytic critique of what she terms the phallocentrism of Western philosophy and culture, and her thought on the question of sexual difference or sexuate difference. She continues to write and publish well into her 90s now. And while her work is now wide-ranging, the themes of sexual difference and women's subjectivity remain central. In this paper, I'm focusing specifically on key arguments that Irigarayan makes in the earlier phases of her work, and these are grounded in psychoanalysis and in her interrogation of the position of the mother in Western thought and culture. So Irigarayan's seminal feminist work, Speculum of the Other Woman, it lays the ground for her philosophical project in offering a critique of what she considers the phallocentrism of Western philosophy, especially in this text, in the work of Plato and Freud. She psychoanalyzes, as it were, Western philosophy, looking for the gaps and silences, looking for what is repressed or remains unconscious. In doing so, she identifies what she comes to describe as the matricide of Western philosophy and culture. The mother has been symbolically killed, as Laura's paper demonstrates pretty clearly. The position of the mother and the dependence on and debt to the mother is ignored, silenced, denied, papered over. And this infiltrates almost all aspects of Western thought and culture and is, she claims, the cause of women's subordinate position in the West at least. The mother does not constitute or qualify as a social or political subject and has no cultural power. She is not recognised as a subject, and this has implications for all women, whether mothers or not. And I'll explain this reasoning in a moment. Irigaray's analysis and her subsequent response is based largely on her psychoanalytic reading of Freud. Irigaray writes in an interview that was published in This Sex Which Is Not One that she begins Speculum of the Other Woman with a critique of Freud because in the process of elaborating a theory of sexuality, Freud brought to light something that had been operative all along, though it remained implicit, hidden, unknown. The sexual indifference that underlies the truth of any science, the logic of every discourse. This is readily apparent in the way Freud defines female sexuality. In fact, this sexuality is never defined with respect to any sex but the masculine, so always constructed in relation to the masculine, and particularly in terms of what it lacks of the masculine. So what Irigaray is referring to here is Freud's reading of femininity and his elaboration of the Oedipal complex in making sense of feminine and masculine sexuality and gendered subjectivity. In Freud's theory of the Oedipal complex, which is named after the myth of Oedipus, who unknowingly murders his father and marries his mother, the male body and male sexuality is given primacy and occupies the position of both positive and neutral, whereas the female body and feminine sexuality occupies the negative or deficient position only. As the theory goes in Freud's Oedipal complex, and this is a very condensed version, and it also gets a little bit weird if you're not familiar with this kind of psychoanalytic theory. So as the theory goes, the girl, realizing that neither she nor her mother have the prized phallus, instead only a so-called deformed penis in the form of the clitoris, rejects her mother and turns her attention toward her father or a substitute father in the figure of a romantic partner, and her energy toward becoming pregnant with a child, which, if it is a male child, is her only chance at possessing physically the phallus. This is, in Freud's terms, the successful resolution of the Oedipal complex for the girl, who thus becomes socialized as appropriately feminine. And there are other potential unsuccessful resolutions of the Oedipal complex, which for Freud include homosexuality or pursuing an academic vocation. In the successful resolution, however, the girl rejects the mother and turns her libidinal energies towards the father, and in doing so, orients away from the so-called active clitoris to the so-called passive vagina. In Freud's reading, which is taken up even if challenged and extended by Irigaray, power and subjectivity is held only by the man, and a woman's only chance of attaining power or subjectivity is to attempt to possess or replicate male power and subjectivity. There is no female or feminine subjectivity. The feminine is conceptualized only in terms of what of the masculine it lacks. Further to this, Irigaray identifies the repression and denial of the mother in Freud's psychoanalytic reading of sexuality. In Freud's theory, subjectivity begins for both the little girl and the boy at the point of separation from the mother. So that's the beginning point. This is disastrous for the girl because while the boy is promised a so-called mother substitute in the form of a romantic partner and can thus return to the mother's body in a sense, the girl must transfer her libidinal energy from the mother to the father. So there is a shift that the boy in some sense does not need to make in a total sense. And in doing so, she shifts her energy away from herself, resulting in what we might today describe as a kind of internalized misogyny. She is thus forever cast adrift from the mother and from herself. She will not return to the mother's body as the boy will, if he himself also successfully resolves the Oedipal complex and is socialized as appropriately masculine and thus heterosexual. In Freud's formulation, which, as Irigaray acknowledges, is a description of a genuine state of affairs, he's sort of he's describing a cultural state of affairs. The pre-Oedipal, pre-spoken language relation to the mother, beginning in pregnancy, is completely absent. There is no recognition of the significance of the mother, her body, and the relation with the mother toward the formation of the subject. And so Irigarayan, in psychoanalyzing Freud, notes this omission and considers it telling. Freud does not think to account for the pre-Oedipal relation with the mother because this relation has been erased in Western culture. This, as Irigarayan points out, is telling of a larger cultural pattern, and she criticises Freud for failing to examine the historical context and factors that render the mother powerless and lacking subjectivity and voice, instead seeming to take this as a given state of affairs. Irigarayan's response to the cultural matricide that she diagnoses is to remedy it, and this forms the basis of her ongoing philosophic project, to create the conditions under which the mother, and thus significantly all women, could be recognised as a subject. If the mother holds power, the girl will not need to reject her, will not turn her energies away from the mother, and thus from herself and other women. And this would transform relations among women, as well as women's social, cultural, and political position. A genuine subject position for women, not one that attempts to replicate or possess the already existing masculine subject position, power, and identity, would be possible. So the task for Irigarayan is largely to retrieve the mother through remembering and recalling maternal histories and genealogies, but also documenting or representing the mother and letting her speak, bringing her back to life, giving her a voice and subject position. So, and bringing the mother back to life in this sense, also crucially for Irigarayan, involves allowing the mother and all women to speak, to cultivate a voice of our own and to become a speaking subject. However, she argues that women must not merely reinscribe the language or culture that women inherit in patriarchal culture. We must speak as women, which is a complicated claim and made more difficult given the culture that we inherit is a masculine one, defined and cultivated by men. She writes in This Sex Which Is Not One, for example, that women's social inferiority is reinforced and complicated by the fact that woman does not have access to language except through recourse to masculine systems of representation, which disappropriate her from her relation to herself and to other women. Irigarayan therefore implores that women must cultivate ways of speaking that depart from the masculine culture that we inherit. So, with this in mind, to speak about the process of matrescence, and perhaps especially of labour and birth, has significant radical potential. Because the experience and activity of the mother and the relation between her and her child, that is the pre-Oedipal mother-child relation, what Freud and others do not acknowledge or seriously examine, is documented and represented in the dominant culture, so publicly, but in women's own language, in women's own discourse, so to speak. Significantly, in these moments, the birthing woman explodes all notions of the stable, uniform, independent subject. It is clear in acknowledging the pregnant and birthing mother that our coming into being is a relational and cooperative encounter. Further, in giving birth, the mother experiences a relation to herself and another that is specific, not universal. Nothing could have prepared me for the psychic jolt of coming face to face with the child who grew inside my body and seemed to transform me from the inside out. I am still, and perhaps will forever be, finding the words to give justice to the enormity of this experience and the ways that it transformed me so deeply. So as a public record of mothers' experiences of pregnancy and birth, Australian Birth Stories documents and represents the pre-Oedipal relationship with the mother in mother's own words, what Irigarayan calls for. And perhaps even if these stories remain amongst mostly women, Australian Birth Stories audience is unsurprisingly made up of mostly pregnant women and their partners or supporters. The podcast gives words to, it makes conscious a complex and layered experience that has been historically overtly and covertly silenced and has thus remained unconscious and repressed even within the minds of mothers. To speak of, or even simply listen to other mothers speak of, the process of these pivotal moments of matrescence especially, thus arguably serves to liberate the maternal subject from within her own psyche, and thus from the repressed position in the wider social or cultural context. And that's where I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Belinda. Another amazing talk.